The tarp flapped like a dying bird in the wind. Naomi Crow pressed her body tighter around her daughter, trying to block the cold, the hunger, the sound of her own fear. Snow had crept in during the night, powdering Mira's curls and stiffening the edges of the threadbare quilt they shared. The girl hadn't spoken in hours, only coughed dry, high, sharp, like brittle twigs snapping in the distance. Naomi didn't cry. Not because she was brave, but because she couldn't spare the water. They hadn't eaten in 5 days, not since the last scrap of hard biscuit 2 towns back. The mule had died in the storm, collapsed mid-trudge on a forest trail with no name. Naomi had tried to cut some meat from its hindquarter before the cold stiffened it, but the blade was dull, her hands numb, and Mira was crying. She chose the child over the carcass. Now they were here, beneath a shredded tarp tied between a broken wagon wheel and a leaning pine with nothing but a rusted pot, a useless hatchet, and a heartbeat that was starting to lose rhythm. Naomi leaned closer to her daughter's ear. "Stay with me, little bird. Don't you fly off just yet." Mira didn't answer. The wind carried a sound, hoofbeats slow and muffled. Naomi froze. She reached for the pot handle, the only thing heavy enough to swing. In these woods, law traveled slower than bullets. It could be a trapper, a drunk, or worse, someone like Victor. Then the wind shifted. A man stepped into view just beyond the snow-shrouded pines. He wore a thick fur cloak that blended with the tree's boots caked in ice and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His silhouette didn't flinch at the sight of Naomi crouched like a wounded fox. He raised one gloved hand. "Don't scream. I ain't here to hurt you." His voice was deep, slow, with the worn edges of someone who didn't speak often. Naomi said nothing. Her grip on the pot tightened. "I got firewood," he said, reaching slowly into the bundle slung over his shoulder. "And bread. Not fresh. But it's real." The smell hit her first smoke and rye and something ancient. He knelt, unwrapped a cloth bundle, and set it on the snow between them. Half a loaf, hard but not moldy. Naomi's body lunged before her mind agreed. She grabbed the bread, tore a piece, and stuffed it into Mira's mouth. The girl's lips moved slowly, then faster. Her eyes blinked open. The man watched, expression unreadable beneath the snow-damp beard. "You got a name," Naomi croaked. He nodded. "Elias. Elias White Elk. I live yonder near the ravine. Cabins warm. Stoves burning." Naomi didn't trust cabins. Didn't trust men in woods with warm stoves. But Mira was breathing easier, and her own knees were shaking. "I can't carry her far," she said. "I'll carry her. You carry the rest." She stared at him for a long moment. Elias didn't flinch, didn't try to soften his offer or sell it. He just waited. Naomi looked at Mira. The child had finished the bread and now slept again gently, this time not with the breathless wheeze of before. Naomi nodded. The trail to Elias's cabin was narrow, snow-packed, and silent, save for the crunch of boots. Naomi walked behind him, watching the way he moved, careful, steady, like someone who never forgot where he was. He carried Mira in one arm as if she weighed nothing. Naomi carried the bundle of rags and cracked tin pot. Her shoulders ached, but her feet kept moving. "You ever seen a man who walks like the trees made him," she whispered once to herself. "That's the one who found us." As they crested a ridge, a shape emerged through the mist, a low cabin of split pine logs dark against the white. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney. 2 goats stood near a fence, bleating faintly. A young woman, not more than 20, stepped onto the porch with a shotgun in her arms. She looked at Elias, then at Naomi. "Trouble, no," Elias said. "Guests. The girl grunted, lowered the gun, and vanished inside. "Who's she?" Naomi asked. "Name's Liddy. Stubborn, sharp, helps when she feels like it." He pushed open the cabin door with his foot. Warmth rushed out like breath. Naomi stepped into the dim room and blinked. Inside, the air smelled of pine and smoke, and something earthy, herbs maybe. A fire crackled in the stove. Blankets lined the walls. It was not a home exactly, but it wasn't a trap either. Elias laid Mira on a cot near the stove. The girl sighed in her sleep. Naomi stood, frozen eyes darting across the room, body tight. Elias turned. "Sit. Warm your hands." She sat slowly. Her fingers trembled as they stretched toward the flames. He handed her a cup. "What's this tea?" "Birch bark, spruce needles, bit of honey." She drank. It was bitter, but it lit something in her chest. She exhaled. "You got blankets?" she asked. "On the wall. Take what you need." Liddy reappeared, eyes narrowed. She tossed 2 pelts onto the floor. "She's a child," Liddy said. "She needs more than scraps." Elias didn't answer. He just watched Mira sleep. Naomi pulled the blankets close and looked at the man. "Why?" He didn't look at her. Just said, "This ain't charity, woman. It's just winter manners." That night, Naomi lay awake beside Mira while snow tapped the cabin roof in soft, steady rhythm. Elias sat by the fire carving something with a bone-handled knife. He didn't speak, didn't glance her way. But Naomi watched the firelight flicker across his face, and something inside her loosened just slightly. She didn't believe in safety. Not anymore. But maybe this was something else. Not safe. Steady. That was enough for now. The fire was already burning when Naomi opened her eyes. Smoke curled toward the ceiling in thin ribbons, orange light pulsing against the cabin walls like a slow, steady heartbeat. Mira slept beside her on the cot, her face flushed with a faint pink, not the fever kind, but the kind that meant blood was moving again. Breathing was easier now, no longer rasping from her chest like broken leaves. Naomi pulled the quilt up around her daughter's chin and sat up. Elias was crouched by the stove, shoving in another log. He didn't look up. "You didn't sleep," Naomi said quietly. He shook his head. "Didn't want the fire going out." She sat on the edge of the cot. "You didn't have to do that." Elias straightened, wiping ash on his trousers. "Didn't do it for you. Did it for her." There was no malice in the words. Just truth. Naomi stood, stretching her legs, careful not to make a sound that might wake Mira. Her limbs still ached from the cold, her back sore from the hard floor, but something inside her had settled, a knot that had been coiled so tight for so long, now loosened just enough to let breath in. She looked around the cabin for the first time in daylight. It was simple pine log walls chinked with moss and clay, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a rack of drying herbs strung above the window. A pile of blankets lined one corner. A longbow leaned in the other. Hooks on the wall held a lantern, a hatchet, and what looked like a string of dried roots. No clutter, no excess. Elias moved past her and stepped outside, boots thudding against the frozen porch. Naomi followed him a few minutes later. The sky had cleared, the storm blown west, leaving behind blue air and a brittle calm. Smoke from the chimney drifted straight up. The trees groaned under the weight of wet snow. A pair of goats huddled near a trough. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. "You live out here alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Most days. And the girl Liddy, she's not mine. Not by blood. She came through here a winter back. Ran from something worse than snow. Stayed. Why help her? Ooh. He didn't stop sharpening. Didn't ask why. Just saw a need. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself. The sun had come out, but it wasn't warm. You planning to stay long? He asked without turning. Naomi hesitated. Just till Mira's strong enough. Then we'll move on. Elias nodded again. Like that answer made sense to him, even if it didn't to her. The door creaked open behind them. Liddy stepped out with a bowl of hot something oats, maybe steaming in the morning air. She handed it to Naomi without a word, then narrowed her eyes. You break that little girl again, and I'll feed you to the bears, she muttered, then disappeared back inside. Naomi blinked. Friendly sort. Elias chuckled once, just a breath. She's better with goats. They ate in silence. Naomi hadn't tasted hot food in over a week. The oats were plain but real. She finished them before her hands stopped shaking. I don't like owing people, she said, not looking at him. You don't. I'm not here for charity. He turned toward her. This ain't charity, woman. It's just winter manners. Naomi stared at him, unsure how to respond. The words landed hard, not because they were harsh, but because they weren't. There was no weight of expectation behind them. Just a fact. He wasn't trying to save her. He was just making sure no one froze to death in his yard. That unsettled her more than kindness would have. Let me help, she said. You gave us food warmth. I can do chores. Clean. Cook. Elias studied her for a moment, then tilted his head toward the stack of chopped firewood. Start there. Naomi nodded. Her hands still trembled, but she welcomed the task. She took the axe from the porch and began splitting the logs that had frosted over during the storm. The rhythm steadied her. The work was familiar, mindless grounding. Mira woke later that morning, her cheeks no longer hollow, her voice barely above a whisper. Naomi held her fed her warm broth Liddy had heated. Mira's small fingers clung to her mother's sleeve. I saw the man, she whispered, the one with the forest eyes. Naomi kissed her forehead. He brought us bread. Will he let us stay for a little while? That night the cabin was warmer. Elias sat by the fire again, this time cleaning a set of traps. Liddy was mending a coat in the corner, her fingers flying through stitches. Naomi scrubbed the pan clean, her sleeves damp and hands red, but it felt good. Useful. They didn't talk much. But it wasn't silence full of suspicion. It was the silence of people who had made peace with quiet. After Mira fell asleep, Naomi sat by the fire, watching the logs crumble into coals. I used to keep books, she said suddenly, at a freight office back in Kansas. Before... Elias looked at her but didn't press. I was good with numbers. Liked the way they balanced. He nodded once. There's calm and order. She looked at him, surprised by the response. You don't strike me as someone who cares for balance. I care for what keeps things standing. The fire crackled between them. Naomi felt something shift. Not trust. Not yet. But the idea of it. She rose. Good night, Elias. He didn't respond with words. Just gave a small nod, the kind that said, You're safe to sleep. Outside, the wind had died. Inside, the fire kept burning. The next morning, as Naomi stepped outside to fetch more wood, she found a pair of snowshoes sitting neatly by the door, her size hand-woven. She turned toward Elias, who stood near the goat pen. I didn't ask for these. He shrugged. Didn't figure you'd want to keep dragging your girl through drifts. Naomi held back a smile, not because she didn't feel it, but because it felt too dangerous to show. Inside the cabin, Mira had started to hum. The next morning came soft with the smell of pine smoke and the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves. Naomi stirred slowly, still not used to the sensation of waking, without fear pressing down on her chest like stone. Mira was curled beside her cheeks, warm breath even. She looked peaceful, something Naomi hadn't seen in months. Elias knocked once on the frame before entering. "We leave after breakfast." Naomi blinked. "Where to see Tope?" "Elder down the ridge. Used to heal for the Lakota camps. You'll want his medicine if the girl's cough flares again." Naomi sat up. "Is he safe?" Elias didn't smile. "Safe don't always mean easy. But yes, safer than not knowing him." They left after a meal of dried venison and fried dough. Elias strapped Mira onto a makeshift sled lined with goat hide, and Naomi followed on the snowshoes he'd gifted. The mountain was calmer now, but the forest still carried weight, each tree bent under memory and weather. They crossed frozen creeks and passed birch trees with bark peeled like old paper. As they climbed, Mira giggled once when a squirrel darted across the trail. The sound startled Naomi more than the animal. She hadn't heard laughter that didn't sound like a memory in weeks. After nearly an hour, they reached a cluster of stone markers that led toward a single hut built against the slope. Smoke drifted from a low chimney. A raven perched on the roof watching. Topaz, Elias said simply. Liddy had stayed behind with the goats, though she'd warned Naomi to watch that old man's eyes, he sees too much. The door creaked open before they knocked. Tope stood in the frame like he'd been expecting them for a year. His skin was leathered hair silver and braided down his back, with a necklace of bone and turquoise hanging heavy over his chest. He didn't speak at first, just looked. At Naomi, then at Mira, then back. "You carry ghosts," he said at last. "But she does not." "Not yet." Naomi swallowed. "We just needed medicine." "You need more than that. But come in anyway." Inside, the air smelled of sage and sweetgrass. Ropes of herbs hung from the rafters. A red cloth was draped over the small window. The only furniture was a bedroll, a wood stove, and a low table cluttered with feathers, stones, and worn tools. Elias nodded to Tope once and took a place near the stove, silent. Naomi sat near Mira on a pile of furs. "You run from someone," Tope said. It wasn't a question. Naomi didn't answer. "You think running keeps her safe? I have to believe that." He crouched beside Mira and placed 2 fingers lightly on her chest, then nodded. "She's strong. But strength like that, it comes from watching a woman who doesn't break." Naomi looked away. Her shoulders stiffened, then dropped. "You don't just survive the mountain you make. It remember your name," Tope added. That line landed deep. She didn't respond, but the words didn't leave her. Tope gave Naomi a small pouch of herbs and instructions on how to steep them. Then he motioned toward the door. "Come. I'll show you something." Naomi hesitated but followed. He led her behind the hut, where a narrow trail climbed toward a ridge. Wind cut across the path, sharp and thin. At the top, they stood before a rock carved with dozens of names etched deeply into the surface, rough and weather-worn. "This is where we mark those who came through the valley and left their pain behind," he said. "Not to forget. Just so they don't have to carry it alone." Naomi stared at the rock. Some names were faded. Others looked fresh. One was carved in the same square, deliberate style as the comb Elias had made for Mira. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "You will," he said. when you stop surviving and start living. Later, back at the cabin, Mira colored with charcoal on a scrap of wood. Elias repaired a broken latch. Naomi cleaned the herbs Tope had given her. The rhythm of the day was quiet, steady. After dinner, Mira climbed into Naomi's lap. "Can we stay here for real?" Naomi's voice caught. "We'll see baby bird. We'll see." That night, after Mira fell asleep, Naomi stepped outside. The sky was endless. Stars pierced the dark like promises. Elias joined her holding 2 tin cups. He handed her one, then said, "Tope likes you. He scared the hell out of me." That's how he knows it worked. Naomi chuckled under her breath. "He said something today. About making the mountain remember your name." Elias nodded. "He says that when he sees someone who's got more fight left than they realize." Naomi sipped from the cup. The tea was bitter but warm. "I think I forgot how to fight." "No," Elias said. "You just fought too long alone." The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It felt full, like a place someone might live. She glanced at him. "Why'd you bring me up here, Elias? You could have just handed us the bread and gone on." His jaw shifted slightly. "I've seen what happens when folks get left behind. I don't like ghosts wandering my woods." "You think I'm a ghost?" "I think you're trying real hard not to become one." She let that sit, then looked up at the stars. "You talk more than I thought you would." He shrugged. "Only when someone's listening." Inside, Mira's cough didn't come once. And in the morning, the girl would ask Elias if he could show her how to track deer, and Naomi would let her go. Because something had shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But something. And that would carry them to the next day. And to the next chapter, too, where Naomi will begin to share the truth of what chased her across 2 states, and Elias will start to understand that this woman and her daughter may be more than just guests of winter. The wind changed that morning. It came down from the north, colder and sharper than the day before. Elias stood outside, eyes scanning the tree line. Naomi noticed how still he went, how his fingers curled slightly, not around a weapon, but close enough. Inside, Mira layered on her coat, humming softly as she wrapped a strip of leather around her wrist. Naomi watched her daughter carefully mimic the knot Elias had shown her the day before. "She's getting bold," Naomi said. "She's learning to hold ground," Elias replied, still facing the trees. They were due to walk the southern ridge that day. Elias had promised Mira he'd show her how to track deer from print to shadow. Naomi would have said no 3 weeks ago. Now she just said, "Bundle her good." Wind's stiff. But something about Elias's silence this morning itched under her skin. At breakfast, he barely touched his food. His eyes kept drifting toward the ravine edge. "You expecting something?" she asked finally. He didn't answer at first. "Then, you ever notice birds go quiet before a storm? Not just rain, something meaner." Naomi's chest tightened. What kind of storm? The kind that walks on 2 legs. That was when she knew. He'd felt it too. They left Mira with Liddy that afternoon. The girl pouted at first, but Liddy distracted her with a pile of scrap leather and instructions to make something that wouldn't fall apart in the wind. Mira took the challenge like it was a duel. Naomi and Elias took the trail south past the goat pen, past the thicket, where the snow still clung to the branches in heavy curls. Naomi walked beside him, boots firm in the crusted path, hands deep in her coat. "You were quiet all morning," she said. "So were you." "Not the same kind of quiet." Elias stopped near a broken pine. The trunk was splintered not by axe or wind, but by force. He crouched beside the base and brushed away snow. Their boot prints. Large. Pressed deep. Not mine. Not yours, he said. Naomi's mouth went dry. How fresh. 3 days. Maybe 2. If he's cutting through the valley, he'll reach the ridgeline tomorrow. Could be anyone. Could be. But it ain't. She knew who he meant before he said it. Victor. She hadn't said his name since Wyoming. Hadn't even let herself think it. But now the memory of him came roaring back, his voice when it turned to ice, his fists, the smell of whiskey and iron and fire. He wasn't just a man. He was a sickness. And sickness didn't forget what it infected. I ran far, she whispered. You can't outrun a man who doesn't care if he dies, Elias said. The words cut straight to bone. Hook line. Truth. They kept moving. For hours they traced signs, broken brush bark scraped where a shoulder might have passed a campsite, with ash too fresh to be old. Naomi's pulse thudded behind her eyes. Why now? She asked. Why find us now? Because you stopped running. That kind of man smells it when a woman finally rests. Naomi's breath caught. He'll hurt her, Elias. Not if I find him first. She turned to him. Why? This ain't your fight. It is now. That was all he said. Nothing noble. Nothing grand. Just it is now. And she believed him. Back at the cabin, Naomi went to Mira first. The girl was proudly holding up a twisted leather loop with a button latch. Look, Ma. I made a wrist catch like Liddy's. Naomi crouched and cupped her daughter's face in her hands. You're the bravest little bird I ever knew, Mira blinked. Are we leaving again? Naomi's heart twisted. No, baby. Not unless we have to. Elias cleaned his rifle in silence that night. Liddy took down a crossbow from a beam Naomi hadn't noticed before. No one spoke it out loud, but they all knew. Something was coming. They took shifts watching the woods. Elias stayed up past midnight. Naomi woke before dawn. The cabin sat silent, waiting. On the 3rd morning it happened. Naomi stepped outside to gather water from the creek bucket. She saw the first mark carved into the tree near the goat pen. A jagged V, deep, fresh. She dropped the bucket. Elias appeared at her shoulder seconds later. One glance and his face turned to iron. He's here, Naomi whispered. What do we do? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was already walking back inside, already loading shells, already shifting into something quieter, colder. By noon, Elias had set traps at the trail's edge. Liddy packed food into bundles tight enough to run with. Naomi braided Mira's hair with trembling fingers. That night they didn't light the stove. No smoke, no light. Just breath and heartbeats. Elias waited on the porch rifle across his knees. Naomi sat beside Mira, holding her close. Her thoughts tumbled like stone down a canyon wall. What if they had to run again? Would Mira survive it? Could she? Could she kill him if it came to that? Could she let Elias do it? The door creaked. Elias stepped back in. He's close. Too close. How do you know? Smelled tobacco, same kind you said he used. She felt her blood drain from her limbs. You stay here with Mira, Elias said. I'm not hiding. He met her eyes. You're not. You're guarding what matters. Then he was gone again. An hour passed. Then another. The quiet was unbearable. Then the unmistakable sound of boots crunching snow. Not Elias's. Too heavy, too slow. Naomi pushed Mira behind the cot. She grabbed the iron poker from the stove and waited, breath caught like thread in her throat. The door didn't open, but a voice came through the cracks in the wood. "Naomi." She froze. "Naomi, that you in there? You took something from me." His voice hadn't changed. It still slithered like oil, still made her feel like her skin didn't belong to her. "You got my girl, and you owe me." Mira whimpered. Naomi gripped the poker tighter. Then crack. A rifle. Close. Silence. More silence. Then Elias's voice. "It's done." They buried the body deep without a name. Liddy said nothing, just salted the soil. Naomi stood over the grave, fists clenched. Elias placed a stone not for the man, but to mark the end of what he brought. Naomi whispered, "Thank you." Elias looked at her. "Don't thank me for what had to be done." That night, Mira slept soundly. Naomi stood outside the cabin, coat wrapped tight, breath visible in the cold. Elias joined her after a while. "You did what you had to," he said. She shook her head. "You did what I couldn't." "No," he replied. "You did it long before I ever showed up. You survived." "That's harder." She didn't cry, but something inside her softened like a frost breaking under sun. The snow had started to melt around the edges of the trees, seeping into the dirt, like old secrets looking for a way out. Naomi stood at the woodpile, axe in hand, splitting logs with steady rhythm. Each crack of blade against pine sent a clean, final sound into the cold morning air. It helped quiet her thoughts, helped push the memory of Victor's voice, Victor's body in the earth, just a little further out of reach. Mira played nearby with Liddy's goat, giggling as the animal chewed on the frayed end of her coat. Inside the cabin, Elias mended the floorboards where snowmelt had begun to seep in. Peace had returned, simple, brittle peace. The kind you don't speak too loud about, or it might shatter. By late afternoon, Naomi noticed it, the silence. Not the good kind. Not the calm before supper kind. This was the silence that made birds vanish, made air hang too still. She dropped the axe, wiped her palms on her coat, and walked toward the front path. Elias was already on the porch, rifle across his lap. "You hear it too?" she asked. "Yeah." They waited. Wind shifted. Then they saw it, just a shape at first, cresting the far ridge, moving slow and upright. A horse. A rider. Not Victor. Not someone Naomi recognized. But the shape moved with purpose. "Stranger?" she asked. Elias nodded once. "And he's not just passing through." The rider arrived just before dusk. A tall man leaned under a dark duster-wide hat, casting shadow over sharp eyes. His horse was sweat-lathered, his gloves thick with dust. He dismounted slow, every motion deliberate. "Evenin'," he said, voice smooth but worn. "I'm looking for someone." Elias stayed seated on the porch. Naomi stepped just behind the doorframe, Mira peeking from behind her legs. The man tipped his hat. "Name's Brannon. Deputy Marshal out of Laramie." Elias didn't blink. "We don't get many lawmen this far up." "Don't usually come this far myself," Brannon said, glancing around. "But I'm following a trail. Man named Victor Bell. Tall, mean temper. Got a scar over his lip like a cracked coin." Naomi's blood turned to ice. Brannon continued. "He's wanted for a string of crimes, Missouri, Kansas, Wyoming. Last known to be traveling with a woman and child. We found tracks up north, a camp half burned and a tree with his mark carved in." Naomi couldn't breathe. Elias kept his voice level. "You're 2 days too late." Brannon raised a brow. That's so he showed up, threatened the girl and her kid, didn't live through it. Brannon scratched his jaw. That's convenient. It's the truth, Naomi said quietly, stepping forward. He was hunting us. Brannon's eyes flicked to her. Name Naomi. She didn't give a last one. Not yet. Brannon studied her for a long beat. You the one he dragged out of that freight office in Wichita? Naomi stiffened. That was years ago. You're the reason we've got 6 bodies in a rail yard and 1 ranger in a box. I was the reason Mira's still alive, she snapped. Elias stood now, slow and deliberate. You here to blame the survivor? Brannon held up a hand. I'm here for answers. Truth don't care who tells it, just wants out. You think I lied? Naomi asked. Brannon didn't answer. He stepped toward his horse, pulled out a leather satchel, and handed Elias a folded paper wanted poster. Victor's face stared back in charcoal lines, mean and crooked. Naomi looked away. I buried him, Elias said. South slope past the broken pine. You want the body, take it. But leave the girl be. Brannon sighed. That ain't all, though. Bell had a brother, Warden Bell, ex-military. Ran with a crew of bounty hunters for a while before he turned half feral. Word is, he's coming. Naomi felt the chill return. He always knows when Victor dies, and he don't take kindly to it. Elias rubbed the bridge of his nose. How much time we got, days maybe less. I rode hard. Thought I'd beat him here. Naomi crossed her arms. Why warn us? Brannon met her eyes. Because I ain't looking to watch more graves get dug. And because Victor was scum. But Warden makes men like Victor look tame. Silence fell like a dropped stone. Then Brannon said, just 'cause you buried the past, don't mean it won't sprout roots. That line stuck in Naomi's chest. Hook line. Truth again. That night, Brannon stayed in the barn, Elias checking the locks twice. Naomi sat near the stove, hands gripping a cup of warm cider. Mira slept beside her thumb, tucked against her cheek. They won't stop, Naomi whispered, one after another. Elias said nothing at first. Then that's the thing about running. Eventually you either stop or get caught. I'm tired of both. He looked over at her. Then maybe it's time to build. Build what a place they can't burn down. She shook her head. You don't understand. Warden's worse. Victor was cruel, but this one's cold, precise. He doesn't come for blood. He comes for legacy. Elias leaned forward. Then we don't run. We don't hide. We hold. Naomi stared into the fire. You really think we can? I think we got roots now. That's how trees stand up to storms. In the morning, Brannon examined the grave, said nothing for a long time, then dropped a stone on top. Might be best if you all vanish, he said, but something tells me you won't. Naomi stood beside him. Not this time. Brannon gave a dry smile. Warden's not like most men. He'll come through shadow. Quiet. He'll look for weaknesses, not fights. He won't find any here, Naomi said. Brannon swung into the saddle. God willing. He left without another word. As his silhouette vanished over the ridge, Naomi turned back toward the cabin, where Mira waved from the porch, wearing her new leather bracelet. She smiled, then froze. A red thread of string had been tied around the post near the goat pen. Thin, delicate, almost mist. Naomi's breath hitched. Elias. He stepped out, eyes already scanning. Then he saw it. He walked over, untied the string, held it in his palm. "What does it mean?" Naomi asked. Elias's face went still. "It means Warden's already watching." Naomi barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin's beams, every wind-rattled branch outside felt like a bootstep. She sat by the fire with the poker in one hand, Mira curled up beside her cheeks, flushed from sleep, not fear. Elias had taken first watch. He didn't speak much after they'd found the red thread, but something in his face had shifted. His jaw was set harder, his eyes constantly moving, scanning not just the woods, but the air between trees, like he expected something to rise from shadow itself. Liddy moved like a woman decades younger, setting traps around the perimeter and sharpening old stakes until her fingers bled. She muttered as she worked snatches of prayer, curses things Naomi didn't fully understand, but trusted like folk magic. By dawn, frost had returned to the windows, thin lace clinging to the glass like breath from a ghost. A late spring cold snap had crept in, as if the land itself knew something was stirring. Naomi stood on the porch, coat pulled tight, staring at the tree line where the snow had hardened overnight. Her breath fogged the air. Everything was too still. The birds hadn't sung since yesterday. No goats brayed. Even the wind felt cautious. Elias stepped beside her, holding a rolled-up map. "Used to be a mine west of here," he said. "Collapsed 15 years back. Nobody goes near it now. Quiet. Covered. If I were planning something, that's where I'd hole up." Naomi's stomach twisted. "You think Warden's there?" "I don't know," Elias said. "But I don't plan to sit here hoping he shows himself." Mira stepped outside just then, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, can I go feed the goats?" Naomi turned, crouched. "Not today, baby bird." Mira tilted her head, sensing the weight in her mother's voice. She didn't ask why, just nodded and went back inside, her tiny form framed by the warm glow of the cabin. Naomi rose and stared into the forest. "I'm tired of reacting." "Then it's time to listen to the land," Elias said. "It always speaks. Most folks just don't hear it." He paused. His eyes narrowed at the distant ridge. "The mountain doesn't echo warnings, it buries what doesn't listen." Naomi turned toward him. "That your way of saying we strike first?" Elias didn't smile. "It's my way of saying we either end this or it grows teeth." By midday, Elias, Naomi, and Liddy were on the move, leaving Brannon behind to guard Mira and the homestead. They moved fast, quiet, like shadows cutting across the forest floor. Naomi had never seen Elias move like this, his steps purposeful, always scanning the terrain, his rifle cradled, but never relaxed. Liddy brought up the rear crossbow, slung tight, muttering again. In her gravel-deep voice, "He'll slip if he's proud." They always do. They crossed the southern creek, the water crusted with fresh ice. Naomi could barely feel her fingers. Every snap of a twig sounded like a shot. Eventually, they reached the path Elias remembered, a barely there game trail, half covered in roots and moss, winding north toward the cliffs. The mine wasn't marked. It didn't need to be. The air itself changed heavier, colder, metallic. Trees leaned back from the rock wall. A curtain of dead brush hid the gaping tunnel mouth. Elias held up a hand. No smoke, no movement. But signs were there. Animal bones picked clean tracks, too deep and too fresh. And near the base of a rock, another thread of red string tied to a broken pine limb. Naomi's pulse jumped. She pulled her revolver. Elias nodded at Liddy, who peeled off to circle around the back slope. "Keep low," Elias whispered. "Don't talk unless you have to, and step where I step." They slipped inside. The mine tunnel swallowed the light. Cold clung to the walls, and the air smelled of wet stone and old sorrow. Naomi's boots crunched softly on gravel. The deeper they went, the more the world seemed to vanish behind them. They saw it all at once. A campfire, long dead but fresh in structure. Next to it, a pile of bones. Deer, maybe, or goat. And scratched into the wall opposite with the tip of a blade, one word. Mira. Naomi froze. She barely registered Elias whispering a curse under his breath. Her grip tightened on the revolver. Her vision tunneled. "This was meant to rattle you," Elias said. It worked. Then behind them, a breath. A scrape of boot. Naomi spun just in time to see a figure drop from a hidden ledge above. Not Warden, too small. A scout, fast, knife in hand. He lunged at Elias. Naomi fired without hesitation. Her shot hit the scout in the shoulder, spinning him. Elias drove the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw before he could scream again. Liddy's voice called down the tunnel. 2 more headed east. Took off soon as they heard the shot. "Let him go," Elias growled. "This whole place is bait. He wanted us out." Naomi's stomach dropped. "Oh God, the cabin." They ran, back through the tunnel, through brush and ice. Naomi's breath tore at her throat, lungs burning with cold. Her legs ached, but she didn't stop. Couldn't. By the time they hit the ridgeline, Naomi saw smoke. Not fire. Not destruction. Signal smoke. Brannon. They burst into the clearing. The cabin stood whole. Mira was on the porch, crossbow in hand, shaking but unhurt. Naomi ran to her, scooping her up. Mira wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, breath hitching. Brannon walked toward them. He came. Didn't speak. Just watched. He held something out. A piece of leather, square and worn. On it, carved in rough, deliberate strokes, Naomi's name. And Mira's. Victor's handwriting. Elias took it, studied the edges. "He's telling you he's not just close. He's inside your head now." Naomi's hand trembled, but her voice didn't. "Then I need to get inside his." That night, no one slept. Brannon dug trenches along the northern edge of the property. Liddy set fresh stakes in the underbrush. Naomi taught Mira how to reload again and again until her daughter's small hands worked from memory. They lit no fire, no lights, just breath and resolve. At dawn, they found the mark, burned into the goat pen gate. A circle. Inside it, a single vertical line. Warden's symbol. Naomi stared at it. "It means bloodline," she murmured. "Dominance, power that passes on." Brannon stood beside her, jaw tight. "He's not playing." Naomi shook her head. "Neither are we." Elias stepped forward. "This ends soon." Naomi met his eyes. "No. This begins now." She turned toward the cabin, toward the people inside. Her home. Her stand. The snow fell harder that morning, fine needle-like flakes that stung the skin and vanished the moment they touched ground. The kind of snow that didn't blanket or soften, but whispered warnings if you knew how to listen. Naomi stood at the tree line, her fingers cold around the grip of her revolver, watching the wind rake through the woods. The brand mark still smoked on the goat pen gate behind her warden's symbol, burned into the wood like a curse. A message. A line drawn in flame and blood. Elias stood to her right, silent eyes locked on tracks that circled the homestead like vultures waiting for death to settle. They'd been deliberate. Just close enough to be seen, not close enough to act. Victor Warden Bell didn't rush. He didn't make mistakes. Inside, Mira refused breakfast. Her hands trembled too much to lift the spoon. Brannon tried to ease her with gentle words and a steady presence, but she barely looked at him. Her eyes flicked constantly to the window, wide and unblinking, waiting for a shape in the snow. "She's got steel in her," Brannon had murmured. "But she ain't steel yet." Naomi hadn't answered. She couldn't. Something inside her had cracked open that she'd worked years to seal shut. That's why she was outside now, needing air, needing space to think through the fog of old fear. But the woods weren't quiet anymore. They weren't still. The trees murmured. The wind whistled in strange pitches. And that's when it hit her, a memory sharp as a bone shard. Victor's hand gripping her wrist in that dim train car. His voice venom soft. "Don't cry in front of her. She don't need your weakness." She had swallowed those tears. For Mira. For survival. Now she swallowed a scream, not of fear but fury. Elias finally spoke. "He's her uncle, isn't he?" Naomi didn't look at him. "Warden," he nodded. "Yeah. Victor's older brother. Blood but never family. He ever claim her never did. Not until now." She turned toward Elias, her voice low and flat. "He doesn't want her because he loves her. He wants her because she's the last thread tying Victor to anything that could feel like legacy. If he takes her, I vanish. She becomes a story he owns." Elias frowned, snow melting in his beard. "You think he'll try to talk first?" "He'll try. Warden always gives you a chance to kneel before he breaks your back." They walked back to the house together, boots crunching through thin crusts of ice. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and sage. Liddy was grinding roots in a clay bowl, her mouth moving in some old language Naomi didn't understand, but trusted anyway. "He's on the ridge," Liddy said, not looking up. Naomi paused. "How do you know?" "The mountain told me," she muttered. "The wind stutters when something unnatural walks it." Mira was by the hearth, drawing with charcoal on parchment. Naomi crouched beside her. "What are you drawing, baby bird?" "A cage," Mira whispered, "but with the door open." Naomi's throat clenched. "That's a good drawing." Mira kept her eyes on the page. "He's not like Victor. He doesn't yell." "You've seen him." Mira nodded. "From the window. He waved once. Like he knew me." Naomi's pulse flinched. She stood, jaw clenched. No more waiting. Brannon looked up from cleaning his rifle. "What are you thinking?" "We pull him to us. On our terms." Elias crossed his arms. "You think he'll come if you call?" Naomi met his gaze. "He already did." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Liddy laid fresh traps, weaving thorn and silver in old patterns. Brannon crafted a decoy in the barn, an old jacket stuffed with straw and gun oil. Elias reinforced the front porch and set mirrored shards on trees to track movement without direct eyes. Naomi sat with Mira, teaching her how to listen. Really listen for the click of a rifle hammer or the drag of boots in snow. She taught her how to load in the dark, how to breathe when the world turned red. By sunset, Naomi climbed to the ridge and scanned the forest through her father's old spyglass. She saw him, tall, motionless, wrapped in a long black coat, like he'd stepped from a nightmare spun by memory. Victor Warden Bell. He made no move. He simply stood and watched. He wanted her to see. He wanted her to feel it. And Naomi did. Not fear, not anymore, but memory and rage. She returned to the cabin without a word. That night, the silence thickened. Naomi sat awake beside Mira until her daughter's breathing steadied. The fire was low. Liddy murmured in her sleep. Outside, Brannon smoked near the porch. Naomi joined him. "You saw him too," he said. She nodded. Brannon blew smoke into the cold. "I saw what he did to two men in Laramie. One opened his mouth wrong. Warden broke his jaw before he could finish the sentence. The other begged. Naomi didn't blink. Let me guess. He didn't beg long." Brannon glanced sideways. "You ever think about how a man like that learns to be still, yeah?" Naomi whispered. "Because he listens to the parts of himself most people run from." She looked toward the woods. "Some wounds don't scar over, they whisper." Brannon nodded slowly. "Well, I hope he hears something else this time." At dawn, Naomi found a note pinned to the door. Midnight. No threats, no instructions. Just the time. She folded it, slipped it into her coat. "He wants a meeting," Elias said from behind. "He wants me to come alone." "You going? I have to." "You don't." She turned to him, her voice hardening. "If I don't, he chooses how this ends. If I go, I set the terms." Brannon stepped in. "What if it's a trap? It is," she said. "But I'll walk into it standing tall." At midnight, Naomi walked alone into the clearing beyond the ridge. The moon hung low, cold and pale. Snow shimmered beneath her boots. He was already there, waiting. Victor Warden Bell. A man carved from silence. He didn't raise a weapon, just nodded once. "You've made a home," he said. Naomi didn't flinch. "You're not getting her. She's blood. She's mine." He took a step forward. "You think you can keep what doesn't belong to you. She was never yours to begin with." Warden's eyes narrowed. "Then we let the mountain decide." He turned and walked into the trees, and Naomi stood there, the cold seeping into her bones, knowing the real fight had just begun. The cold didn't leave with Warden. It settled in deeper like a second skin wrapping around the land. The snow stopped falling, but the air turned bitter still, as if the mountain was bracing for what it already knew was coming. Naomi came back from the ridge in silence. Her boots were soaked. Her jaw clenched so tight her molars ached. Inside the cabin, she took off her gloves, laid them on the hearth, and looked over at Mira asleep with one hand gripping the stuffed cloth rabbit she'd stitched from an old feed sack. Elias watched from the corner, eyes narrowed, body still. "What did he say?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She walked to the table, poured a cup of cold coffee, and downed it like whiskey. Then she looked up, her voice hollow. "He didn't have to say anything. He'll be back by midnight tomorrow. And he won't come alone." Brannon exhaled through his nose and rose from a stool. "He's bringing guns." Naomi nodded. "At least 3, maybe more. He's not coming to make a point. He's coming to erase us." She glanced at each of them in turn. "So tonight, we prepare. We fight on our soil with our hands, with everything we've built." Liddy, who had been sitting in a corner grinding dried sage and cedar bark, murmured something low, rhythmic. Naomi didn't catch the words, but the tone was enough to stir something primal in her chest. They went to work. Naomi and Elias began reinforcing the barn walls and installing fresh bolts on the cellar door. Brannon laid down a new trap line with barbed wire and twine soaked in bear grease. Liddy etched strange symbols in the frost, with ash and coal markings, older than English, maybe even older than war. Mira followed Naomi like a silent shadow, helping wherever she could, gathering nails, handing off hammers. But Naomi could see it in her daughter's eyes, the confusion, the burden of being the reason this storm had found them. At one point, Naomi caught her whispering to the feed sack rabbit, promising it she'd protect Mama. Her throat clenched. By dusk, Naomi had finished layering steel plates beneath the cabin's windows. She stood outside, staring out toward the dark tree line, hands trembling from more than cold. Elias joined her, his coat lined with dust from the tool shed. "You okay?" She shook her head. "No, but I know what I have to do." He looked at her, then past her. There's power in that. Knowing. Naomi crossed her arms tight. He's not just after Mira. He wants to erase Victor. Me. This whole place, turn us into a footnote. Elias nodded slowly. We won't let him. Naomi didn't reply. Later that night, as they sat around the fire planning their positions, Brannon looked up and said, "You don't dig graves on this mountain unless you plan to fill them." The words hit like a warning, but also a promise. Naomi glanced at him. "Then let's make sure the right ones get filled." The morning came gray and still. No birds, no wind. Even the trees seemed reluctant to move. Liddy scattered her protective dust around the porch and muttered her prayers. Mira helped by tying twine loops on the goat pen fence. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. Naomi handed Mira the small revolver they had refurbished together 2 winters ago. "You only shoot if you have to," she said. "And if you do, you don't miss." Mira nodded. "I mean it. I know, Mama." The final preparations took all day. They reinforced the porch rail with sandbags. Elias rigged an old bell trap in the upper branches of the birch. Brannon placed a row of oil cans behind the barn, tied to a trip line. Dusk dropped fast, and then the forest changed. It wasn't sound they would have preferred sound. It was silence, the kind that came before thunder. Naomi felt it first, a prickling down her neck, as if the air behind her had taken on weight. "They're here," she said. The first shape emerged from the trees like a ghost. A tall figure wrapped in fur, carrying a long rifle on his back. Then 2 more behind him, all walking in sync, slow, deliberate. Last came Warden. He didn't walk like a man entering enemy ground. He walked like he already owned it. Naomi stepped into the yard. No weapons drawn, but her hand hovered near her sidearm. "You're early," she said. He stopped 10 paces from her. "I'm always early. It's the ones who show late that usually end up in the ground." Naomi smiled coldly. "Well, we've got plenty of ground. You looking to be part of it?" He smiled, barely a twitch. "I want the girl. You want control. Legacy. I'm not handing you either." "She's blood," Warden said again. "She's more than that. She's better." The man to Warden's left stepped forward. Big, mean-looking. Naomi's hand twitched, but she didn't flinch. "She doesn't belong to you," Warden said. "You're keeping her in a lie. I'm keeping her alive." Warden gave a slow nod. "Then you've made your choice." He raised a hand. Everything exploded. A crack of gunfire. Brannon's rifle barked from the shadows. The big man fell backward, bleeding from the shoulder. Elias fired from the rooftop, forcing the second man behind a tree. Naomi dove sideways, rolled, came up firing. Her shot grazed Warden's coat. He didn't blink. Liddy's crossbow thudded. Screamed. One of the attackers collapsed. Warden's men tried to retreat, but Brannon and Elias flanked them, pushing hard. Naomi sprinted to cover Mira, who stood in the cabin doorway, jaw clenched, hand on her revolver. "Stay back," Naomi shouted. Another bullet cracked the porch beam inches from Naomi's head. She dove again, returned fire, and hit something. Someone. She didn't stop to see who. Warden stood in the center of the yard, untouched, calm. Their eyes met. Next time, he said, and vanished into the trees. It took 10 minutes to realize it was over. 2 of Warden's men were dead. The third limped off, bleeding. Brannon had a graze on his leg, but he'd live. Elias was winded. Liddy had a cut on her cheek. Naomi. She was whole. But inside she wasn't. She sat beside Mira, pulled her into her arms, and felt her daughter shake for the first time. Not from cold, from the weight of knowing what life costs. Naomi whispered into her hair, "We're still here. That's what matters." Outside, Elias lit a lantern and said to no one in particular, "He'll come back." Brannon spit blood into the snow. "So will we." Naomi stood and looked out at the dark woods. "He came to test us," she said. "Now he knows." They gathered the bodies, dug graves behind the barn. Mira watched as they were lowered in. She didn't cry. Not until she whispered, "Will you have to kill him?" Naomi didn't answer right away. "Then if he makes me." And in the wind, somewhere deep in the forest, a howl rose. Not a wolf, but something older and hungrier. Naomi didn't sleep. None of them did. The cabin creaked beneath the shifting weight of fresh snow, wind curling through the cracks like fingers. The scent of gunpowder still clung to the air, a memory that refused to leave. Mira lay near the hearth, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, her stuffed cloth rabbit pressed tight to her chest. Her eyes were closed, but Naomi could tell she wasn't sleeping. Children's silence was different when it carried fear. Naomi sat by the window, revolver in her lap, watching the tree line. Her knuckles were white, but her body was still. Something about the way the dark pressed against the glass made her feel like the mountain itself was watching her. "You're bleeding," Elias said behind her, holding out a cloth damp with warm water. Naomi looked down at her left sleeve. A long graze just above the elbow. She hadn't noticed it until now. "It's fine," she muttered, but she took the cloth anyway. "Fine turns to festering up here." She pressed it to the wound. The sting cleared her head. "He's not done," she whispered. "No," Elias agreed. "That wasn't a retreat. That was a test." Naomi turned her gaze back out the window. "Then it's time we set the terms." The next morning came gray and grim. Wind rattled the eaves. Snow fell like ash, slow, steady, smothering. Brannon slammed a fresh log into the fire, breaking the silence. "We can't stay boxed in like this. We're just waiting to get picked off." Naomi didn't answer right away. She moved to the table and unfurled the old tribal map her father had kept hidden for years. A different kind of map, no towns, no roads, just markings passed down through story and symbol. She ran her finger along one path, stopping at a crescent-shaped grove etched in faded red ink. "There," she said. Elias leaned over her shoulder. "The burial grounds, it's sacred," Liddy muttered from the corner. "Even Warden wouldn't dare desecrate it." Naomi's eyes stayed on the map. He would. But that's what we want. We draw him there. End it where it all began. Brannon raised a brow. "You sure?" "No," Naomi said. "But I'm done waiting to be hunted." She turned to the group. "I'll go alone. You all stay back flank if necessary. Mira stays here with Liddy. No matter what." Mira, sitting quietly by the fire, stood. "No." Naomi blinked. What, I'm coming with you. Naomi crossed the room and knelt in front of her daughter. Mira, baby bird, I need you to be safe. That's all that matters. Mira stared at her unblinking. He won't stop unless he sees me. Naomi opened her mouth to argue, but then stopped. Mira's voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't the same girl who hid under the floorboards 2 days ago. All right, Naomi said softly, but you stay behind the line until it's time. Mira nodded. Then Naomi whispered more to herself than anyone. The hardest part of mercy is knowing when not to give it. They left just before dusk. Snow muffled every step. Naomi carried her father's old rifle across her back. Mira wore a thick cloak that made her look smaller than she was, but she didn't complain. Brannon and Elias peeled off before the halfway point, each taking a ridge above the grove. Liddy remained at the cabin with 2 revolvers and her knife. By the time Naomi and Mira reached the crescent grove, the sky had gone indigo. Moonlight spilled through gaps in the trees. The place felt ancient, heavy with memory. Naomi set her pack down by the old stone altar, an overgrown remnant of an older tribe ringed by bent trees and mossy stones. She checked her rifle. Loaded. Mira stood beside her, small but steady. And then they waited. 10 minutes. Then 15. Then a crunch. Warden stepped into view. Alone. No posse. No theatrics. Just him in his long black coat, eyes gleaming under the moon. You chose this place, he said. Naomi didn't move. I figured it was time we stopped pretending we were anything but animals. Warden smiled faintly. You always did have your father's temper. She raised her rifle. And your brother's mark. Let's finish this. He stepped into the circle. You won't shoot me. You think I brought her here to watch me hesitate. She's a child. She's stronger than you'll ever be. Warden tilted his head. Let her choose. Naomi's breath caught. Then Brannon's shot rang out from the ridge. Missed, but on purpose. Warden ducked, drew his sidearm, fired into the trees. Elias returned fire from the left, pinning him down. Naomi rushed forward, shoved Mira behind the altar. Warden scrambled behind a fallen log. Blood soaked through his coat from a hit to his side. Not fatal, but close. She stepped into the open rifle leveled. He looked up at her, still defiant. Do it, he growled. Be the story you're afraid of. Naomi's hands tightened, but she didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she looked at Mira. Come here. Mira stepped forward. Warden blinked, confused. She doesn't even know me. She knows enough, Naomi said. Mira looked down at him, this man who had haunted her life without ever truly being in it. He smiled through bloody teeth. You're mine, girl. No, Mira said. I'm hers. And then she raised her small revolver. Naomi tensed. Mira. But her daughter didn't fire. She looked back at her mother and said, The hardest part of mercy is knowing when not to give it. Then she holstered the weapon. Warden laughed once, a short, bitter sound. You'll regret that. Naomi stepped in, eyes burning. No, you will. She turned her back on him. Brannon and Elias emerged from the trees, guns raised. What now? Elias asked. Naomi answered without looking. We bury the past, alive. They tied Warden's hands, stripped his weapons, and marched him out of the grove. He didn't speak again. Back at the cabin, Liddy opened the door, eyes narrowing at the sight of him. You bring rot into this house, we bring proof, Naomi said. The mountain knows justice. They locked him in the root cellar. Reinforced the door, posted a guard. Naomi washed Mira's hands in the basin, neither speaking. The water ran red with dirt and cold. Then Mira said, "I don't want to be like him." "You're not," Naomi said, cupping her cheek. "You're better." Outside, the mountain wind began to shift again, but this time it sounded less like warning and more like release. Snow fell steady through the night, masking everything in a hush so deep it felt unnatural. By morning, the homestead looked untouched, clean, calm, like the violence that had passed through days earlier had been nothing but a bad dream. But Naomi knew better. Peace was never that polite. She stood on the porch with her coffee cooling in one hand, the other resting on the old hunting rifle leaning beside her. Her eyes were locked on the forest edge where the dark pines stood too still. The cold bit into her bones, but she didn't move. Stillness had a sound, and this wasn't it. Inside the cabin stirred slowly. Elias and Brannon argued low and sharp by the stove while Mira quietly fed the goats out back. Naomi heard it all, every word, every silence between them. "We can't keep him down there," Brannon snapped. "He's not some stray we picked up on the ridge. He's a threat." "He's in chains," Elias replied. "What's he gonna do, claw his way through 6 inches of timber and a locked trap door? You think he doesn't have help coming? I think if we kill him, we'll have blood on our hands we can't wash off." Naomi stepped inside, snow trailing from her boots. Her voice cut through the tension like a knife. "He stays in the cellar. But not because he's harmless. Because justice isn't blind, it remembers faces. And we're going to let the mountain remember his." That shut them up, for now. Warden hadn't spoken since the night they'd brought him back. Chained to the wall in the root cellar, he sat in silence, barely eating, barely sleeping. But Naomi knew better than to think silence meant surrender. Liddy was the only one who approached him, bringing food and water twice a day, never closer than necessary. She never spoke, never made eye contact. But she never missed a visit. On the 3rd day, Naomi went herself. She descended the creaking steps and stopped just out of reach of his chain. He looked thinner, pale, but his eyes were sharp. Too sharp for a man who'd been beaten and caged. "I should have let Mira shoot you," Naomi said. Warden smiled through cracked lips. "But you didn't. You came here to claim what was never yours. She's blood." "She's not yours," Naomi snapped. "She never was. You want to write your legacy in someone else's skin, not this time." He leaned forward, metal links clinking. "You think you're justice. You're just delay." "No," Naomi said. "I'm memory. And memory outlasts blood." She turned and walked back up the stairs. Behind her, his voice followed like a shadow. "Justice always comes due, Naomi. Even up here." That night, Mira curled up beside Naomi on the cot. The storm had settled, but the air still hummed with tension. Outside, the wind rattled loose shutters. Inside, the fire hissed low. "Will he die down there?" Mira asked. Naomi hesitated. "I don't know. I don't want to kill him. You won't have to. But I don't want anyone else to either." Naomi looked into her daughter's eyes. So steady for someone so young. "What he did, what he tried to do, it can't be undone," Naomi said. "But maybe we don't need revenge. Maybe we just need to keep living." "Even if he doesn't," Naomi nodded slowly. "Especially if he doesn't. But fate doesn't like being kept waiting." By the 5th day, the crows came. Hundreds of them blackening the trees outside the ridge. They cawed loud and long, circling like they knew something no one else did. It set Brannon on edge. "This ain't natural," he said, peering through the window. "Crows mean death." "No," Elias muttered. "Crows mean someone's watching." An hour later, smoke rose from the northern ridge, thin, purposeful, controlled. Naomi saw it first. His men, she whispered. The ones we didn't kill. They're signaling. They know he's alive. How, Elias asked. Doesn't matter, Naomi replied. They're coming. They fortified the cabin again, hammered boards over the cellar door, reinforced the windows. Liddy scattered black salt around the porch and burned cedar at the corners. Mira helped in silence, eyes sharper than the knife she used to strip bark. That night, Naomi woke with a start. Something had shifted. She rushed to the cellar. The lock was still there. The door hadn't moved. But Warden was gone. Not escaped. Taken. Chains left cold and open. On the wall, written in soot and blood, were 4 words. Blood always finds blood. Panic swept through the cabin. We should have killed him, Brannon snarled. We let a viper live and now we're bleeding again. He's not acting alone, Liddy said. That mark on the wall, it's a call. He's being protected. Naomi stood in the doorway, staring out into the snow-covered world. He's headed north. How do you know? Elias asked. Because that's where I'd go to start over. Or end it, Brannon muttered. Naomi turned to Mira. You don't come this time. Yes, I do, Mira said. Her voice was low but firm. Naomi stared at her for a long time, then nodded. They tracked Warden for hours through ice-crusted passes and ravines carved by spring melt. The air grew thinner. The trees changed older, twisted, covered in moss like armor. They found the camp at dusk. Warden stood at its center, flanked by 2 men Naomi didn't recognize. Armed, ready. He saw her, smiled. I knew you'd come. You didn't escape, Naomi said. You were led out. No one escapes judgment forever, he said. But sometimes you bring it with you. Behind her, Brannon took aim. Naomi raised a hand. No. She stepped forward. Justice isn't blind, it remembers faces, she said. And it remembers yours. Warden's smile faded. Mira stepped beside her mother, eyes locked on the man who had once called himself kin. I'm not afraid of you, she said. Warden said nothing. Elias and Brannon fanned out rifles ready. Naomi raised her gun. Choose, she said. Stand trial. Or fall now. Warden looked around at the trees, the mountain, the sky. Then quietly, trial. Naomi exhaled. The past had come calling, and for once it would answer. The trial didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a clearing surrounded by old pines and frost-bitten silence beneath a sky bruised violet, where breath curled white in the air, and the past finally demanded its due. There was no judge, no jury box, and no oaths taken on leather-bound books. Just a firestones and people too scarred to pretend justice was a formality. Warden sat bound to a stump, his wrists raw from rope ankles lashed to frozen earth. His coat was stiff with dried blood, his own and others. Despite everything, he still held his chin up, eyes sharp, spine straight, like the man believed his story hadn't ended yet. Naomi stood across the flames, arms crossed. She hadn't slept much. Her face was wind-burned. Her lips cracked, but her voice was steady. You said you came for blood, she began. Well, here we are. This isn't justice, Warden muttered. It's vengeance with prettier words. No, Elias said, stepping forward. Truth doesn't need a gavel, it needs a backbone. And we're full up on both. Brannon paced behind Warden like a caged wolf chewing on a toothpick that had long since splintered. Start with what you did to her mother. Warden squinted at the fire. She made her choice. She didn't choose you, Naomi cut in firm. You forced yourself into her life, and when she tried to leave you, punished her. You talk like you knew her better than I did. I did, Naomi said, because I stayed. For a long moment the fire hissed and popped. Snow flurried into the light like ashes. No one moved. Then Liddy stepped up, pulling her shawl tighter against the wind. I remember when your men poisoned the wells. My baby sister coughed herself to death while you moved on like nothing happened. I didn't poison them, Warden replied. You gave the orders, Elias snapped, and you didn't stop them. They were loyal, Warden said. They were killers, Naomi said, and so were you. He didn't answer. They didn't hold a trial with speeches. Instead, they told stories. Simple truths. Not about law, but about consequences. Elias spoke of a friend shot in the back while riding to town. Brannon told of his older brother, a ranger found buried beneath burnt logs and torn saddle leather, never identified except for his belt buckle. Ridge folk described cattle-mutilated cabins, torched women run off screaming into the trees. Each story was a stone dropped into a well too deep to echo. Warden never denied any of it. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. It was as if he'd grown too used to carrying ghosts to be bothered by new ones. Until Mira stepped forward. She was small against the firelight, hair tangled from wind, but her eyes were calm. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at Elias or Liddy. She looked at Warden. I used to have nightmares, she said. But they weren't about wolves or storms. They were about a man with my eyes. Naomi reached out instinctively, but Mira didn't move. Her hands were clenched at her sides, knuckles white. I spent years wondering if the dark parts of me were yours, she said, voice steady. Now I know they're not. Warden tilted his head. His lips moved, but no sound came. You don't get to call yourself my kin, Mira finished. You gave that up before I was born. For the first time, Warden looked small. Not humbled, not sorry. Just old. When the stories ended, they passed the basin. A rusted iron pan from the barn filled with snow, and a layer of soot at the bottom. Each person approached with a stone, smooth river stones they'd pulled from the creek, each one representing judgment. Dropping a stone into the basin meant he was guilty. Keeping it meant mercy. No one kept their stone. Brannan's hit the basin first, loud sharp. Elias followed. Then Liddy, then Ridgefolk. The air seemed to hold its breath between each clink. Naomi held hers longer than anyone. It was flat, dark gray with a crack running through it. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother's hands, then of Mira's, and then of the quiet that might finally come. She dropped the stone. Clink. At sunrise, they led Warden up the ridge trail. Not to hang him, not to shoot him behind a barn. They took him to the place where the land had once been hollowed for iron, an old quarry turned graveyard. No speeches, just wind. Brannon pulled his rifle free and checked the chamber. 1 round. Elias untied Warden's hands slowly without a word. Naomi stepped forward, holding something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it, a stone with her mother's name carved into it. Simple. Deep. Meant to last. Mira stood beside her stone in her own hand, eyes locked on the ledge ahead. You could run, Elias said, but there's nowhere left to go. I'm not afraid to die, Warden muttered. You should be afraid to be forgotten, Naomi replied. That won't happen, he said. I left blood behind. Not all blood becomes legacy, Mira said. Some just gets buried. Warden didn't respond. Naomi nodded to Brannon. He raised the rifle. The wind blew harder. Mira turned her face. The shot rang out like a thunder crack in the cold. Warden dropped. They buried him with no cross, no prayer. Just rocks stacked over frozen earth, heavier than guilt. Mira placed her stone last. Her fingers brushed snow from the top before she turned. Elias lit a cedar branch and left it burning nearby. Let the mountain do the rest. They walked back through the trees in silence, step by step, leaving the past where it fell. Naomi stopped at the trail's bend and looked back. The sky was clear. No birds, no echoes, just stillness. The kind you earn. The snow began to melt 3 days after the trial. It started slow. Just a soft drip off the eaves, a trickle carving through the frost at the edge of the cabin steps. But it was enough. Enough to wake the earth, enough to make Naomi pause mid-step on the porch, listening to water find its path again. Inside, Mira sat by the hearth with a piece of driftwood in her hands and a carving knife balanced against her thumb. She wasn't shaping anything particular, just letting her hands move shaving curls from the wood, each slice a breath of silence. Brannon was gone before sunrise, headed south to trade hides. Elias lingered longer than usual, helping restack the split logs out back and mend a hinge on the root cellar. But he left too. They all did, and for once it didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. Naomi didn't say much that week. Neither did Mira. But silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't avoidance or grief or tension. It was shared. A kind of quiet that let them breathe. Late one evening, Naomi found herself kneeling beside the fire, not because it needed tending, but because she did. She stared into the coals and finally whispered what had sat heavy on her chest. I hated him for so long, I didn't know what I'd be without that weight. Mira looked up from her carving. Do you feel lighter now? Naomi smiled barely. No, but I feel more honest. Mira nodded, then went back to carving. Outside, the wind no longer howled. It hummed. A week later, Naomi climbed the ridge alone. She brought nothing with her except a blanket and a flask of coffee. The trail was still slick in parts, patches of black earth exposed where the sun had done its slow work. She took her time, boots steady against the rocks, fingers brushing bark as she passed old trees. At the quarry edge, she stopped. The stones marking Warden's grave were undisturbed. Snow had melted in streaks between them, leaving lines like veins across the mound. Naomi sat cross-legged, unfolding the blanket beneath her. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stared out over the wide stretch of valley below. The world looked open, honest. I used to wonder if I'd ever understand how you became who you were, she said, voice steady. But I think the better question was, how do I make sure I never do? She sat in silence for a while, the wind tugging gently at her braid. Then she took out a slip of paper from her coat. It was weather-worn, soft at the edges and blank. I thought I'd write you a letter, but I realized I don't owe you words. I owe them to her. To the girl you left behind. The one I raised. And she's not a victim anymore. She's not your shadow. She's light. She's mine. Naomi folded the paper, once placed it beneath a rock, and stood. She didn't cry. She'd done that already. Back at the cabin, Mira was chopping kindling. The rhythm of the axe was clean and steady, 2 splits, then a breath, then 2 more. Naomi watched from the edge of the woods for a minute before walking into the clearing. You do that like someone who's thinking too much, Naomi said. Mira looked up, sweat beading her forehead. Thinking's better than feeling sometimes. Naomi nodded. but not always. They didn't speak again until the woodpile was stacked and the sun had dipped low behind the ridge. That night they cooked together real food: beans, salt pork bread made from scratch. They even shared a few dried apples they'd been saving. Naomi caught herself laughing once when Mira nearly dropped the skillet and muttered something too sharp for her age. And in that moment, the cabin felt like a home again. Spring came early that year. Birdsong returned to the trees. The stream thawed and ran swift again. Saplings pressed up through the frost-hardened ground like they had something urgent to say. Naomi and Mira cleared the small garden plot behind the barn and planted new seeds. It was hard work, honest work, the kind that leaves your back aching but your heart light. One morning Mira came in with a bundle of wildflowers and set them in a tin cup on the table. Naomi stared at them for a long time before saying, "You know what that means, don't you?" Mira shrugged. "They're just flowers." "No," Naomi said. "They're forgiveness." Mira didn't answer. She didn't need to. A letter arrived in early April. Elias had written it in a careful, slanted hand, addressed simply to Naomi and the girl. He spoke of a town further west where the land was fertile and the community small but kind. He said there were folks rebuilding a schoolhouse and a church, people looking for hands to help and stories to share. Naomi read it twice before passing it to Mira. "What do you think?" she asked. Mira folded the letter slowly. "I think it's time we write our own story." Naomi smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." They packed what they needed, left the rest for whoever might come next. Before leaving, Naomi carved 2 names into the porch beam, hers and Mira's, not to mark territory, to mark survival. The trail west was long and rough in places, but it didn't feel like running. It felt like becoming. Along the way, they met others: ranchers, widows, orphans, and drifters. Some stayed the night, others just passed by. But every soul they met seemed hungry for the same thing: peace earned, peace chosen. And slowly, Naomi realized something she hadn't expected. She wasn't afraid anymore. Of quiet, of love, of memory. One night they camped beneath a sky littered with stars. Mira lay curled in her blanket beside the fire, already drifting off. Naomi sat up, staring at the embers. She thought of her mother, of Brannon, of Elias, of Mira's small hand gripping hers after that first long winter. And she whispered like a prayer, "We are more than what they gave us." They arrived in the valley a month later. It wasn't paradise, but it was enough. A cabin stood half-built near a creek. Chickens wandered loose in the brush. A young couple smiled when they saw them approach. "We heard you might be coming," the woman said. "You'll find good earth here. Not perfect, but good." Naomi looked at Mira, and Mira looked ahead toward the hills that rolled like old stories waiting to be written. Naomi took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, she wasn't holding anything back. Not grief, not fear, not even hope. Because hope, she'd learned, wasn't something soft. Hope was the decision to stay, to build, to trust. Hope was a seed, and they were finally ready to plant it.